The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains when Jake Thompson heard the screaming. He had been fixing a broken fence post on his small ranch, the kind of work that needed doing before the heat of the Arizona day made everything twice as hard. The wire cutters fell from his hands as the sound reached him, high, terrified voices that made his blood run cold. Jake was not a young man anymore. At 42, his hands were rough from years of working cattle, and his face was weathered from too many days under the desert sun. He had seen his share of trouble in this wild territory, but something about these screams was different. They were the voices of children. He dropped everything and ran toward his horse, Thunder, a sturdy bay mare who had carried him through more dangerous situations than he cared to remember. As he rode hard toward the sound, memories of his own lost family flooded back. 3 years ago, raiders had taken everything from him, his wife Sarah, his 2 young sons. The pain of that loss had never left him, like a wound that refused to heal. The screaming was coming from the direction of the Whitman homestead, about 2 miles east of his property. Tom Whitman was a good man, a farmer who had moved out here with his family just last spring, hoping to make a new life. Jake had helped them build their cabin and had shared many evening meals at their table. Tom had a wife named Mary and 2 daughters, Emma, who was 8, and little Lucy, barely 5 years old. As Thunder's hooves pounded against the hard desert ground, Jake could see smoke rising in the distance. His heart sank. Smoke usually meant one thing out here, trouble of the worst kind. The Apache had been restless lately, pushed harder and harder by the army and the growing number of settlers. Jake understood their anger, even if he could not accept what they sometimes did because of it. When he reached the Whitman place, the cabin was already half destroyed by fire. Bodies lay scattered in the yard. Tom and Mary, their dreams of a new life ended in violence. But there was no sign of the girls. Jake searched frantically through the smoke and debris, calling their names, but found nothing. Then, he saw the tracks, unshod horses heading north into the mountains, the kind of tracks that told a story he did not want to believe. The Apache had taken Emma and Lucy. Jake knew what this meant. In 3 days, maybe 4, those little girls would be so far into Apache territory that finding them would be nearly impossible. The army would not help, they had their hands full with other troubles, and 2 settler children were not their priority. The other ranchers would shake their heads sadly and say it was too dangerous, too late. But Jake could not accept that. Not again. Not when he had a chance to save someone. He rode back to his ranch as fast as Thunder could carry him. His mind was already working, planning what he would need for the journey ahead. Food, water, ammunition, medicine, and, most importantly, knowledge. Jake had lived in this territory for almost 15 years. He had traded with some of the Apache bands during peaceful times, had learned some of their language, understood some of their ways. It was not much, but it might be enough. As he packed his supplies, Jake thought about what he was about to do. Following Apache warriors into their own territory was close to suicide. They knew every canyon, every waterhole, every hiding place in those mountains. They could disappear like smoke when they wanted to, or fight like demons when they were cornered. Many good men had ridden into those mountains and never come back. But, as Jake loaded his rifle and checked his pistol, he kept seeing the faces of Emma and Lucy Whitman. Emma with her serious brown eyes and the way she always helped her mother with the cooking. Little Lucy with her golden curls and her laugh that could light up a room. They did not deserve what was happening to them. No child did. Just before sunset, Jake was ready to leave. He had enough supplies for a week, maybe longer if he was careful. Thunder was rested and ready for the hard journey ahead. As he swung up into the saddle, Jake looked back at his small ranch one last time. There was a good chance he would never see it again. The trail north was clear enough at first. The Apache had not tried to hide their tracks, probably believing no one would be foolish enough to follow them. Jake rode steadily through the night, stopping only to rest Thunder and to check that he was still on the right path. The moon was bright, which helped, but it also made him an easy target if anyone was watching. By morning, he had reached the foothills of the mountains. Here, the trail became harder to follow. The Apache were beginning to be more careful, choosing rocky ground where horses left fewer marks, crossing streams to break their scent trail. But Jake had learned to read sign from an old Apache tracker years ago, and he pressed on. It was late in the afternoon of the second day when he first saw them. Jake had been following what he hoped was the right path up a narrow canyon when he heard voices ahead. He quickly led Thunder into a stand of juniper trees and climbed up onto a rocky ledge where he could see without being seen. Below him, in a small clearing beside a spring, was an Apache camp. There were maybe 15 warriors, their horses grazing nearby. And there, sitting beside one of the campfires, were Emma and Lucy Whitman. Jake's heart pounded as he studied the scene below. The girls looked unharmed but terrified. Emma had her arm around little Lucy, who was crying quietly. The Apache warriors ignored them mostly, going about the business of setting up camp for the night. But Jake could see that the girls' hands were tied, and there were guards nearby. As he watched, trying to figure out some way to get the girls away from their captors, Jake noticed something strange. Some of the Apache women in the camp were painting marks on Emma and Lucy's faces white and red paint in patterns that Jake did not recognize. The girls submitted to this silently, too frightened to resist. Jake had seen Apache face paint before, but these markings were different. They seemed more elaborate, more ceremonial. As the painting continued, he saw some of the warriors nodding and talking among themselves, gesturing toward the girls. Something was happening here that went beyond a simple raid and capture. One of the older women, her gray hair braided with beads and feathers, seemed to be directing the painting. She spoke in rapid Apache to the others, and Jake caught a few words that he recognized. Words about spirits, about signs, about something powerful. The woman touched Emma's forehead gently, almost reverently, and spoke again. That was when Jake understood that these were not ordinary captives. Something about these girls, or something about the markings being painted on them, had special meaning to the Apache. This changed everything. It might make rescuing them harder, or it might give him an advantage he had not expected. As darkness fell over the canyon, Jake remained hidden on his rocky perch, watching and planning. The Apache had posted guards, but they seemed relaxed, confident that no one had followed them this deep into their territory. They were probably right, no sane man would attempt what Jake was thinking of doing. But then, Jake had stopped thinking of himself as entirely sane the day he lost his own family. The camp settled down for the night, with most of the warriors rolling up in their blankets around the dying fires. The guards changed every few hours, but Jake noticed that they spent most of their time watching the approaches to the canyon, not paying much attention to what was happening inside the camp itself. Around midnight, Jake made his move. He had decided against trying to fight his way out. 15 Apache warriors were far more than one man could handle, no matter how desperate he was. Instead, he would have to rely on stealth and surprise. If he could get close enough to cut the girls' bonds and get them to the horses without raising an alarm, they might have a chance. Moving as quietly as he could, Jake worked his way down from the rocks toward the edge of the camp. Every shadow could hide a sentry, every sound might give him away. His heart hammered so loud in his chest that he was sure everyone in the camp must be able to hear it. The girls were sleeping beside the cold ashes of one of the fires, still tied but covered with a blanket someone had given them. Jake could see the painted markings on their faces even in the dim starlight, complex patterns of white and red that seemed to glow against their skin. He was only 20 feet away when Lucy woke up. The little girl's eyes went wide when she saw him, and Jake held his breath, waiting for her to cry out. But, instead, Lucy looked at him for a long moment, then carefully shook Emma awake. The older girl saw Jake immediately and started to speak, but he put his finger to his lips and shook his head. Moving carefully, Jake crept closer to where the girls lay. He could see now that their bonds were made of rawhide, tough but not impossible to cut. His knife was sharp, and if he was careful, he could free them in seconds. The hard part would be getting to the horses and away from the camp before anyone noticed they were gone. But, as Jake reached for his knife, a hand fell on his shoulder. "I do not think that would be wise, white man." Jake spun around to find himself facing an Apache warrior, a man about his own age with intelligent eyes and scars that spoke of many battles. The warrior was not holding a weapon, which surprised Jake. If their positions had been reversed, Jake would have put a gun to the Apache's head immediately. "You have come far to find these children," the warrior said in English that was accented but clear. Why? Jake straightened up slowly, his hand moving toward his pistol. But he stopped when he realized that other warriors had appeared silently around him. He was surrounded, and any sudden movement would likely get him killed, and probably get Emma and Lucy killed as well. They are innocents, Jake said finally. They do not deserve what has happened to them. The Apache warrior studied him for a long moment. Many innocents have died, white man. Many of our innocents. Our children. Our women. Your people have not always been so concerned about such things. Jake could not argue with that. He had seen what the army did sometimes, what some of the settlers did when they thought they could get away with it. The violence went both ways, and it seemed like it would never end. That does not make this right, Jake said. The warrior nodded slowly. Perhaps not. But these children are not ordinary captives. The markings on their faces, they tell us something important. Something that changes what we must do with them. Jake looked down at Emma and Lucy, who were watching this conversation with wide, frightened eyes. The painted patterns on their faces seemed to shift and move in the flickering light from the small fire one of the warriors had rekindled. What do the markings mean? Jake asked. The warrior was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell him. They mean that these children have been chosen by the spirits for something special. The old women, they see things sometimes. Signs. Visions. When we brought these children to camp, the eldest of our medicine women saw the signs in their faces. She painted the sacred markings to honor what the spirits have shown her. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. Chosen for what? But before the warrior could answer, a commotion broke out on the other side of the camp. Shouts, the sound of running feet, horses snorting and stamping. Jake turned to see what was happening and saw something that made his blood run cold. More Apache warriors were riding into the camp, and they were driving a group of captives ahead of them, 3 white women and 2 men, all of them looking terrified and exhausted. But it was not just the new captives that made Jake's heart sink. It was the number of warriors with them. What had been a group of 15 Apache was now closer to 30. And, from the look of their war paint and weapons, these were not just raiders looking for horses and supplies. These were warriors preparing for something much more serious. As the new arrivals made their report to the leader of the group, Jake caught enough Apache words to understand the general meaning. There had been fighting to the south. Soldiers were coming. The peaceful time was over, and it was time for war. And, somehow, Emma and Lucy Whitman, 2 little girls from a farming family, had become central to whatever the Apache had planned. The warrior who had been speaking to Jake gestured for him to move away from the girls. As Jake reluctantly stepped back, he saw the old medicine woman approaching, her eyes bright with an intensity that was both fascinating and frightening. She looked at Jake for a long moment, then spoke in rapid Apache to the warrior beside her. He translated her words, his voice respectful but troubled. She says you are part of what the spirits have shown her. You're coming here tonight, it was not chance. It was meant to be. Jake stared at the old woman, trying to understand what was happening. What does that mean? It means, white man, that your fate is now tied to these children, just as theirs is tied to what is coming. The spirits have spoken, and we must all listen. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Jake found himself a prisoner of the Apache, but also something more, a participant in events that seemed larger than anything he had ever imagined. The painted markings on Emma and Lucy's faces seemed to tell a story that he was only beginning to understand. And, somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of war drums beginning to beat. The war drums echoed through the canyon all morning, a steady rhythm that seemed to make the very rocks vibrate. Jake sat with his hands bound, watching as the Apache camp transformed around him. Warriors who had been relaxed the night before now moved with deadly purpose, checking weapons, painting their faces with symbols Jake did not recognize, preparing for something that felt like the end of the world. Emma and Lucy huddled close to him, their painted faces streaked with tears. The markings the old medicine woman had put on them seemed even more elaborate in the morning light: white circles around their eyes, red lines running from their foreheads to their chins, and symbols on their cheeks that looked like lightning bolts or maybe bird wings. Jake had never seen anything like it. The Apache warrior who spoke English, whose name Jake had learned was Nailnish, sat down across from them. His face was grim as he watched the preparations around the camp. "Your soldiers killed 3 of our children yesterday," Nailnish said without looking at Jake. "Shot them down like animals while they played by a stream. The war chief has decided that the time for patience has ended." Jake felt his stomach turn. He knew how these things went: violence leading to more violence, each side claiming justice while innocents died. What does that have to do with these girls? Nailnish finally looked at him, and Jake saw something in the man's eyes that might have been regret. "The old woman, changing woman, she has visions sometimes. Dreams that show her things that will happen. 3 days ago, she dreamed of 2 white children with the markings of our ancestors on their faces. She saw them standing between 2 armies, stopping a great battle with their presence." "That is just superstition," Jake said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt doubt creeping into his mind. "Is it?" Nailnish asked. "You came here alone, following our trail into territory where no white man has any business being. You could have been killed a dozen times over, but here you sit. Tell me that is not strange." Jake looked down at Emma, who was listening to every word despite her fear. The 8-year-old girl met his eyes, and, for a moment, he saw something there that was older than her years. Something that made him think of his own lost sons and the dreams he sometimes had about them. "What are you planning to do?" Jake asked. Before Nailnish could answer, a commotion broke out near the edge of the camp. A young Apache scout came riding in hard, his horse lathered with sweat. He spoke rapidly to the war chief, gesturing toward the south. Jake caught enough words to understand: soldiers, many soldiers, coming up the canyon. The war chief, a man called Red Hawk whose face was a map of old battle scars, listened to the report and then began shouting orders. Warriors grabbed their weapons and began moving toward defensive positions in the rocks around the camp. Others started gathering the horses, preparing to move deeper into the mountains. But Changing Woman stepped forward and spoke, her voice carrying clearly over the noise of preparation. Every warrior stopped to listen. She pointed at Emma and Lucy, then at Jake, speaking in rapid Apache that sounded like prophecy or prayer. When she finished, Red Hawk argued with her, his voice angry and urgent. But the old woman stood her ground, repeating something over and over until the war chief finally threw up his hands in frustration. Nailnish turned to Jake, his face troubled. "She says the children must stay here. She says if we move them now, before the right time, the vision will be broken and great disaster will follow." "You cannot leave them here," Jake said, struggling against his bonds. "If soldiers find them tied up in an Apache camp, they will assume the worst. And if we take them with us, they will slow us down and probably die in the fighting that is coming," Nailnish replied. "Changing Woman says the spirits will protect them until the time is right." Jake looked around the canyon, trying to think of some way out of this nightmare. The sound of the approaching soldiers was getting louder. He could hear horses, the jangle of equipment, voices carrying on the wind. Maybe 20 men, maybe more. If they found an Apache camp with white captives, there would be no talking, no negotiation. Only violence. "Let me take them," Jake said suddenly. "Cut our bonds and let us go. I can get them away from here before the soldiers arrive." Red Hawk, who had been listening even though he pretended not to understand English, spoke to Nailnish in Apache. The conversation was heated, with several other warriors joining in. "He says you are part of the vision now," Nailnish finally told Jake. Changing Woman dreamed of a man with eyes like winter sky who would come for the children. She says if you leave now, everything will be ruined. "This is madness," Jake said, but even as he spoke, he felt something strange happening around them. The air seemed to be getting thicker, charged with electricity like the moments before a thunderstorm. The painted markings on Emma and Lucy's faces seemed to be glowing faintly, though that might have been a trick of the light. Little Lucy, who had been silent for hours, suddenly spoke up. "The pretty lady told me not to be scared," she said in her small voice. She said everything would be all right if I was brave. Emma looked at her sister with concern. What pretty lady, Lucy? There is no lady here except the old Indian woman. The lady in white, Lucy insisted. She comes to me when I am sleeping. She tells me things. Jake felt his blood run cold. Sarah, his dead wife, had always worn white dresses. She had loved white more than any other color, said it made her feel clean and new. But that was impossible. Lucy had never met Sarah, had never even seen her. Changing Woman must have heard something in Lucy's voice that caught her attention, because she came over and knelt beside the little girl. She spoke gently in Apache, and, to Jake's amazement, Lucy seemed to understand her. The 5-year-old nodded and spoke back in broken Apache words, as if she had been learning the language for months instead of days. The old medicine woman's eyes went wide. She called out to Red Hawk, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward Lucy. Other warriors gathered around, listening with expressions of awe and fear. What is she saying? Jake demanded. Nelnish looked shaken. The child spoke the old words, the sacred language that only medicine people know. She told Changing Woman about a vision she had, a white woman with kind eyes who showed her how to stop the fighting. The sound of approaching soldiers was much closer now. Jake could hear individual voices, could make out the commands being shouted as they prepared for whatever they might find in the canyon. There was no more time for mystical visions or ancient prophecies. In minutes, this place would become a battlefield. But, instead of fleeing, the Apache warriors took positions in the rocks around the camp, as if they intended to make a stand. Red Hawk spoke to his men, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led war parties for many years. Jake caught enough words to understand the plan. They would hold the soldiers here, fight them in the narrow confines of the canyon where superior numbers would matter less. It would be a slaughter. The Apache would fight bravely, but they would be outnumbered and outgunned. And, when the battle was over, Emma and Lucy would be caught in the middle of it all. This is wrong, Jake said to Nailnish. Those girls have nothing to do with your war. Perhaps, the Apache warrior replied. But, Changing Woman says they are the key to ending it. She says the markings on their faces will turn the tide when the time comes. What does that even mean? Before Nailnish could answer, the first soldiers appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They came carefully, spread out in a skirmish line with their rifles ready. Jake recognized the uniform of the 7th Cavalry, and his heart sank. These were experienced Indian fighters, men who had been chasing Apache across the territory for years. They would not hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. The officer leading them, a captain with a black mustache and hard eyes, called out in a voice that echoed off the canyon walls. You are surrounded. Surrender now and no one needs to die today. Red Hawk's response was a war cry that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Apache warriors appeared from behind boulders and, in crevices that Jake had not even known were there, their rifles trained on the soldiers below. The captain cursed and dropped behind cover just as the first shots rang out. The battle that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The Apache fought like demons, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, making every shot count. But, the soldiers were disciplined and well-equipped, and they had the advantage of better weapons and more ammunition. Emma and Lucy crouched beside Jake, covering their ears against the deafening noise of gunfire. The painted markings on their faces seemed to catch the light from the muzzle flashes, making the symbols appear to dance and shift. And then, something impossible happened. One of the soldiers, a young private who could not have been more than 18, broke cover and charged toward the Apache position. He was screaming something about his dead brother, his rifle firing wildly as he ran. 2 Apache warriors rose from behind a boulder to meet him, and, for a moment, it looked like the boy would die in a hail of bullets. But, Lucy Whitman stood up. The 5-year-old girl rose from where she had been hiding, her small figure silhouetted against the chaos of the battle. The painted markings on her face seemed to blaze with their own light, and she raised her tiny hand toward the charging soldier. Stop, she said, and, though her voice was small, it carried clearly over the noise of gunfire. Please stop hurting each other. The effect was immediate and stunning. The young soldier stumbled to a halt as if he had run into an invisible wall. The Apache warriors lowered their rifles. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. In the sudden silence, Lucy walked forward, her sister Emma close behind her. The painted symbols on both girls' faces were definitely glowing now, with a soft light that seemed to come from within their skin. "The lady in white told me what to say," Lucy announced, her childish voice carrying to every corner of the canyon. "She said I should tell everyone that the fighting has to stop now, or something very bad will happen." Jake felt his bonds suddenly loosen and fall away, though no one had cut them. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the two little girls who had somehow become the center of a miracle he did not understand. The young soldier was crying now, his rifle forgotten in the dirt. "I saw her," he whispered. "I saw a woman in white, standing right behind the little girl. She looked just like my mother." More soldiers appeared at the mouth of the canyon, but they made no move to advance. Their captain stared at Emma and Lucy as if he were seeing ghosts. Several of the Apache warriors had lowered their weapons entirely, and Jake could hear them murmuring prayers in their own language. Changing Woman walked forward slowly, her eyes never leaving the two girls. She spoke in Apache, her voice filled with wonder and reverence. Nailnish translated for Jake and the soldiers. "She says the spirits have shown their power through these children. She says anyone who continues to fight in their presence will bring a curse upon themselves and their families." Captain Morrison, the cavalry officer, stepped forward with his hands raised to show he was not threatening anyone. "I need to understand what is happening here," he said, his voice strained. "These children, they were taken from the Whitman homestead 2 days ago. We came to rescue them." Red Hawk emerged from his position in the rocks, his rifle held low but ready. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "Children were brought to our camp, yes. But spirits marked them as special. Old Woman saw visions." "Sir," one of the soldiers called out, his voice shaking. "Something is happening to the girls." Jake turned to look at Emma and Lucy and felt his world tilt. The painted markings on their faces were changing, the symbols shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns. But, more than that, the girls themselves seemed different, older somehow, more aware, as if something ancient and wise was looking out through their eyes. Emma spoke, and her voice carried an authority that no 8-year-old should possess. "We are not just Emma and Lucy anymore," she said. "We carry the spirits of all the children who have died in this fighting, white children and Apache children, all of them together. They want the killing to stop." The captain took a step backward, his face pale. "This is not possible." But Lucy nodded solemnly. "The lady in white showed us how to carry them all. She said it was the only way to make the grown-ups listen." Jake felt tears running down his face as he finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him in his dreams. This was not about rescuing 2 little girls from Apache raiders. This was about something much larger, about breaking the cycle of violence that had consumed the territory for so many years. The painted markings on Emma and Lucy's faces continued to shift and change, telling a story in symbols that spoke to something deeper than language. And, as the markings changed, Jake could see the effect they were having on everyone in the canyon. The young soldier who had charged the Apache position was now sitting on the ground, his head in his hands. Several of the Apache warriors had put down their weapons entirely and were singing what sounded like prayers. Even Captain Morrison looked shaken, as if everything he had believed about the world had just been called into question. But Jake also noticed something else: the markings were taking a toll on the girls themselves. Emma was swaying slightly on her feet, and little Lucy's face was pale beneath the glowing paint. Whatever power was flowing through them, it was not without cost. "They are getting weaker," Jake said, stepping forward. "Whatever this is, it is hurting them." Changing Woman nodded grimly. She spoke in Apache, her words urgent and worried. "She says the spirits cannot stay in the children's bodies for long," Nailnish translated. "If the message is not heard and accepted soon, the girls may not survive carrying such a burden." Captain Morrison looked around the canyon at his men, then at the Apache warriors who still held their weapons. "What message? What are they trying to tell us?" Emma answered, though her voice was growing fainter. There has to be a truce. A real one, with promises that both sides will keep. The spirits of the dead children will not rest until their deaths mean something. And, if we refuse? The captain asked. Lucy looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 5-year-old face. Then, the fighting will get worse and worse until everyone is dead. The lady in white showed us what happens if the killing does not stop. She showed us the whole territory covered in blood. Red Hawk stepped forward, his scarred face thoughtful. If white soldiers give word, Apache will consider peace. But, word must be strong. Must be backed by Great Father in Washington. I do not have authority to negotiate treaties, Captain Morrison said. I am just a captain. Then, find someone who does, Emma said, and, suddenly, she collapsed. Jake caught her before she hit the ground, feeling how hot her small body was beneath the painted markings. Lucy was swaying too, and he scooped her up as well, holding both girls as they struggled to stay conscious. Enough, he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. They are mine to protect. I will not let them die for your politics and your wars. The words seemed to hang in the air, and Jake realized that this was the moment-changing woman had seen in her vision. This was when everything would change, when someone would finally say that the children mattered more than the fighting. The painted markings on Emma and Lucy's faces began to fade, the supernatural glow diminishing as the spiritual burden lifted from their small shoulders. But the effect they had created in the canyon remained. Captain Morrison holstered his pistol and walked forward with his hands empty. I give you my word as an officer that I will ride to the territorial capital myself and request a peace negotiation. These children. He looked down at Emma and Lucy in Jake's arms. They have shown me something I do not fully understand, but I know it is important. Red Hawk nodded slowly. And I give word that no Apache warrior will attack white settlements while peace talks happen. But if talks fail, fighting begins again. It was not a perfect solution, Jake knew. There would be complications, arguments, probably violations of the truce by hotheads on both sides. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning was all you could hope for. As the Apache warriors began to withdraw deeper into the mountains and the soldiers prepared to escort Jake and the girls back to safety, Changing Woman approached them one last time. She touched Emma and Lucy gently on their foreheads, speaking softly in Apache. What did she say? Jake asked Nailnish. The Apache warrior smiled for the first time since Jake had met him. She said the spirits are proud of what the children did today. And she said you were right to claim them as yours to protect. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones we choose, not the ones we are born into. Jake looked down at Emma and Lucy, who were sleeping peacefully in his arms despite everything that had happened. The painted markings were almost gone now, leaving only faint traces on their faces like the memory of a dream. But he knew he would never forget what he had seen in that canyon. And he knew that his life, and theirs, had been changed forever by the power of two little girls who had carried the hopes of the dead and turned them into something like hope for the living. 3 weeks after the miracle in the canyon, Jake Thompson sat on the porch of his ranch house watching Emma and Lucy play in the yard. The girls had recovered from their ordeal, at least on the surface. They laughed and ran like normal children, but sometimes Jake would catch them staring off into the distance with expressions far too serious for their ages. The painted markings had faded completely from their faces, but he suspected the memories of what they had carried would stay with them forever. The territorial governor had indeed come to negotiate a peace treaty, just as Captain Morrison had promised. The talks were being held in the town of Copper Creek, about 30 miles south of Jake's ranch. Representatives from several Apache bands had agreed to attend, including Red Hawk and even Old Changing Woman, who had insisted that she needed to be present to ensure the spirits were properly honored. But the negotiations were not going well. Jake learned this from Father Martinez, the Catholic priest who ran the mission in Copper Creek and who had been asked to serve as a neutral mediator in the talks. The priest had ridden out to the ranch that morning, his face grim with worry. There are too many people on both sides who do not want peace, Father Martinez explained as he sat at Jake's kitchen table, gratefully accepting a cup of coffee. Some of the ranchers are demanding that all Apache be removed from the territory entirely. And some of the younger Apache warriors say the whites can never be trusted, that fighting is the only way. Jake looked out the window at Emma and Lucy, who were teaching Jake's old dog how to fetch a stick.
What about what happened in the canyon? Did you tell them about that? Father Martinez nodded.
I did. Captain Morrison testified about what he saw, and several of his men backed up his account. But many people are unwilling to believe such a story. They say it was mass hysteria, or trickery, or the effects of the desert sun.
And what do you believe, Father?
The priest was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I have seen many strange things in my years serving in this territory. I have learned not to dismiss anything too quickly, especially when it involves children and the power of faith.
He looked up at Jake.
But I also know that miracles are fragile things.
They can be easily forgotten when people are angry and afraid.
That afternoon, after Father Martinez had left, Jake found himself thinking about the priest's words. The peace treaty was supposed to be signed in 3 days, but if the negotiations continued to go badly, there might not be anything to sign. And if the treaty failed, the fighting would start again, probably worse than before. That night, Jake was awakened by the sound of crying. He found Lucy sitting up in her bed, tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "The lady in white came to see me again," Lucy said, her voice shaking. "She is very sad. She says the grown-ups are forgetting what we showed them in the canyon." Jake felt his heart sink. "What else did she say?" "She says there is going to be more fighting soon if someone does not do something. She says the spirits of all the dead children are getting restless because their sacrifice is being wasted." Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "I had the same dream," she said quietly. "The lady told me that we might have to carry the spirits again, but this time it might kill us." Jake gathered both girls into his arms, feeling a fierce protectiveness surge through him. "That is not going to happen," he said firmly.
"I will not let anything hurt you, not again."
But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew that the situation was bigger than what any one man could control. The peace treaty was hanging by a thread, and if it failed, the whole territory would explode into violence. The Apache would resume their raids, the army would respond with even more brutal force, and innocent people on both sides would die. The next morning brought news that made everything worse. A young Apache warrior named Firecrow, who had opposed the peace talks from the beginning, had led a raid on a supply wagon heading to Copper Creek. 2 teamsters had been killed, and the wagon had been burned. The raid was clearly intended to sabotage the negotiations, and it was working. The territorial governor was threatening to call off the talks and order a military solution instead. The Apache representatives were angry that they were being blamed for the actions of one rogue warrior. Trust was breaking down on all sides, and the fragile hope that had emerged from the canyon was crumbling. That evening, as Jake was trying to figure out what to do, he had an unexpected visitor. Nailnish, the Apache warrior who spoke English, rode up to the ranch house as the sun was setting. He looked exhausted and worried. "I need to speak with the children," he said without preamble.
"Changing woman sent me.
She says the spirits are calling to them again." "Absolutely not," Jake said, stepping between Nailnish and the house.
"Those girls have been through enough. I will not let them be used again."
"You do not understand," Nailnish said urgently. "Firecrow and his followers are planning something terrible. They are going to attack the peace talks tomorrow, kill everyone there, white and Apache alike. They want to start a war that will never end." Jake felt his blood run cold.
"How do you know this?"
"Because Firecrow tried to recruit warriors from our band. When Red Hawk refused to join him, Firecrow said he would prove that peace was impossible by destroying it completely. He has maybe 20 warriors with him, all young men who have lost family to white violence." Emma and Lucy appeared at the door, still in their nightgowns. They had been listening to the conversation, and Jake could see in their faces that they understood the implications. "The lady in white told us this would happen," Emma said quietly. "She said we would have to choose between our own safety and the safety of everyone else." "You are children," Jake said desperately. "This is not your responsibility.
But Lucy stepped forward, her small face determined. "Yes, it is," she said. "We are the ones who can carry the spirits. If we do not do it, who will?" Nailnish knelt down to look the girls in the eye. Changing Woman says there might be another way this time. Instead of carrying all the spirits like before, you would only need to carry one. The spirit of the first white child to die in this territory, and the spirit of the first Apache child. They want to stand together and show that the children of both peoples can be united. Would it be dangerous? Jake asked. Yes, Nailnish admitted. But not as dangerous as before. And Changing Woman says she knows a way to protect them better this time. Jake looked at Emma and Lucy, seeing the same expression on their faces that he had seen in the canyon, a mixture of fear and determination that belonged to people much older than their years. These girls had already done more than anyone should ask of children. But, if they did not act, many more people would die. If we do this, Jake said slowly, I go with them. I am not leaving them alone again. Nailnish nodded. Changing Woman said you would say that. She says it is good the children need someone to anchor them to the world of the living while they speak for the dead. The next morning, Jake loaded his rifle and saddled Thunder, preparing for what might be the last ride of his life. Emma and Lucy sat behind him on the horse, both of them unusually quiet. They had insisted on wearing the white dresses that had belonged to Jake's wife Sarah. Somehow, the garments fit them perfectly, as if they had been made for this moment. The peace talks were being held in the church in Copper Creek, which Father Martinez had offered as neutral ground. Jake and the girls arrived just as the morning session was beginning, with representatives from both sides filing into the small building. The atmosphere was tense, with Apache warriors and white officials eyeing each other suspiciously. But, as soon as Emma and Lucy entered the church, everything changed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and everyone could see their breath in the suddenly cold air. The girls walked slowly down the center aisle, their white dresses seeming to glow in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. As they reached the front of the church, the faint outlines of painted markings began to appear on their faces, not the elaborate symbols from the canyon, but simpler marks. 2 white dots on each girl's forehead, and a single red line down each cheek. But, this time, they were not alone. 2 ghostly figures materialized beside them, the translucent forms of children, one white and one Apache, both appearing to be about Emma's age. The ghost children reached out and took Emma and Lucy's hands, and, when they did, the entire church filled with a soft, otherworldly light. The Apache child spoke first, his voice echoing strangely in the sacred space. I was the first of my people to die when the whites came to our land. I was killed for the crime of drinking from a stream that my family had used for generations. Then, the white child spoke, her voice equally eerie and sad. I was the first of my people to die in Apache country. I was killed because some white men had stolen Apache horses, and my family paid the price for their crimes. Emma stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the church. We died because of anger and fear and misunderstanding. We died because the grown-ups on both sides chose fighting instead of talking. Lucy nodded solemnly. But we do not want anyone else to die like we did. We want the children who are still alive to have a chance to grow up in peace. The effect on the assembled negotiators was immediate and profound. Several of the white officials were weeping openly, and Jake could see Apache warriors wiping tears from their eyes. Even the territorial governor, a hard man who had seen his share of frontier violence, was visibly shaken. But, then, the church door burst open, and Firecrow stormed in with a dozen painted warriors behind him. Lies, he shouted, his rifle raised toward the altar. White man's tricks to make us weak. There can be no peace with those who steal our land and kill our children. The ghostly children beside Emma and Lucy turned to face Firecrow, and, for a moment, their forms became more solid, more real. When they spoke, their voices carried the authority of all the innocent dead. You would dishonor our sacrifice, the Apache ghost child said. You would make our deaths meaningless by ensuring that more children die as we did. Peace is not weakness, the white ghost child added. War is easy, anyone can fight and kill. Peace requires courage, and wisdom, and the strength to forgive.
Fire Crow wavered, his rifle shaking in his hands. But they took everything from us. Our land, our way of life, our future. And what will more fighting give you back? Emma asked, stepping toward the angry warrior. Will killing more white children bring back the Apache children who have already died? Will burning more homesteads restore the buffalo to the plains? Lucy joined her sister, her small voice carrying surprising power. The spirits of the dead do not want revenge. They want the living to learn from their sacrifice. They want the children of tomorrow to have a chance at happiness that they never got to experience. Jake watched this confrontation with his heart pounding, ready to throw himself between the girls and Fire Crow if necessary. But something extraordinary was happening in the church. The ghostly children were growing brighter, more substantial, and their presence seemed to be affecting everyone in the room. One of Fire Crow's warriors, a young man who could not have been more than 18, slowly lowered his weapon. My sister died in the last raid, he said quietly. She was only 6 years old. She always said she wanted to be friends with the white children in the settlement, but she never got the chance. My son was killed by Apache last year, one of the white negotiators said, his voice breaking. He was Emma's age. I came here wanting revenge, but... He looked at the ghost children, then, at Emma and Lucy. I cannot imagine he would want me to hurt these little ones just because of who their people are. Fire Crow was backing away now, but his rifle was still raised. This is spirit trickery, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It is not real. The ghost children moved toward him, their forms becoming so solid that they cast shadows on the church floor. Touch us, the Apache child said, extending his translucent hand. Feel how real our pain is, and how real our hope is. Fire Crow stared at the outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched the ghost child's fingers. The effect was immediate. Fire Crow screamed and dropped his rifle, falling to his knees as visions flooded his mind. Jake could not see what the warrior was experiencing, but, from his reaction, it was both terrible and transformative. When Fire Crow finally looked up, his face was wet with tears. I saw them all, he whispered. All the children who have died. White and Apache, Mexican and Chinese, all of them together. They showed me what this territory could be like if the killing stopped. The ghost children smiled and began to fade, their mission complete. As they disappeared, the painted markings on Emma and Lucy's faces faded as well, leaving them looking like ordinary little girls again. But the effect they had created in the church remained. Fire Crow stood up slowly and walked to where Red Hawk sat with the other Apache negotiators. He knelt before the older warrior and spoke in rapid Apache, offering his rifle as a gesture of submission and regret. Red Hawk accepted the weapon and then helped Fire Crow to his feet, embracing him as a father would embrace a repentant son. The territorial governor stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. I think we have all seen something today that puts our disagreements in perspective, he said. Perhaps it is time to stop arguing about details and start working on solutions. Over the next several hours, the treaty came together with surprising speed. There would be a reservation for the Apache, but with generous boundaries and the right to hunt and gather on traditional lands. White settlers would be compensated for any losses, but there would be no retaliation for past raids. Most importantly, there would be schools where Apache and white children could learn together, ensuring that future generations would grow up understanding each other rather than fearing each other. As the sun set over Copper Creek, Jake sat with Emma and Lucy on the church steps, watching the last of the negotiators depart. The girls were exhausted but happy, relieved that their burden had finally been lifted. Do you think it will last? Emma asked. The peace, I mean. Jake considered the question carefully. I think it will last as long as people remember what you showed them today. And, even if they forget, I think there will always be children like you to remind them. Lucy yawned and leaned against Jake's side. The lady in white said this was the last time we would have to carry the spirits. She said they could rest now, because people finally understand. And, what about you two? Jake asked. What do you want to do now? Emma smiled,
looking more like a normal 8-year-old than she had in weeks. "I want to go home with you and help you fix that fence you were working on when all this started. And I want to play with the dog," Lucy added. "And maybe learn how to ride thunder." Jake laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I think we can arrange that." As they rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Jake reflected on everything that had happened. He had set out to rescue 2 little girls and had ended up being part of something much larger, the end of a war that had torn the territory apart for years. But, more than that, he had found something he thought he had lost forever when his own family died. He had found purpose, and love, and the chance to make a difference in the world. Emma and Lucy were not his daughters by blood, but they were his daughters by choice, and that bond was stronger than anything that could be broken by violence or fear. They had faced the spirits of the dead together, had carried the hopes of the living, and had emerged as a family forged by something deeper than mere circumstance. As they reached the ranch and Jake helped the girls down from Thunder's back, he looked up at the stars and whispered a prayer of thanks to Sarah, wherever she was. She had sent him to save these children, but, in the end, they had saved him just as much as he had saved them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the peace treaty would need to be honored, the territory would need to heal from years of violence, and Emma and Lucy would need to learn how to be children again after carrying burdens far beyond their years. But, tonight, they were simply a family coming home, and that was enough. 5 years had passed since the miracle in the church at Copper Creek, and the Arizona Territory had become a different place. The peace treaty had held, though not without challenges and occasional setbacks. There had been incidents, hotheads on both sides testing the boundaries, misunderstandings that could have escalated into violence. But, each time trouble arose, people remembered the ghost children in the church, remembered Emma and Lucy Whitman Thompson standing between 2 worlds with painted faces and voices that carried the weight of the dead. Jake Thompson stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse he had built on his ranch, watching his daughters, for that was how he thought of them now, legally and, in his heart, work with their students. Emma, now 13 and growing into a beautiful young woman, was teaching a mixed class of Apache and white children how to read English. Lucy, 10 years old and full of the mischief that had been suppressed during her ordeal, was helping the younger children with their arithmetic. The school had been Jake's idea, inspired by a conversation with Changing Woman 2 years after the peace treaty was signed. The old Apache medicine woman had visited the ranch one autumn day, bringing gifts of beadwork and dried herbs. She had sat with Jake on his porch, watching Emma and Lucy play with some of the Apache children who had come to visit. "The peace we made," Changing Woman had said in her careful English, "it is like a plant that needs tending. If we do not water it, if we do not care for it, it will die. What do you suggest?" Jake had asked. The old woman had pointed at the children playing in the yard. "They are the water," she had said simply. Apache children and white children, growing up together, learning that they are the same where it matters. But they need a place to do this learning. So Jake had used most of his savings to build the schoolhouse, and had hired a teacher from back east, a young woman named Miss Sarah Collins who had the patience of a saint and the determination of a general. But it was Emma and Lucy who really made the school work. The other children, both Apache and white, looked up to them with a mixture of awe and affection. Everyone in the territory knew their story, knew what they had done to bring peace. But fame was a heavy burden for 2 young girls to carry, and Jake worried about them constantly. The worry had been justified 3 months ago, when a newspaper reporter from San Francisco had arrived wanting to write about the miracle children of Arizona. The man, a smooth-talking fellow named Garrett who wore city clothes and asked too many questions, had wanted to photograph Emma and Lucy in authentic frontier costumes and had suggested they paint symbols on their faces to recreate the famous scene in the church. Jake had thrown the man off his property with language that would have made a cavalry sergeant proud. But the incident had shaken Emma and Lucy badly. They had spent that night sitting on Jake's porch, talking about what their lives had become and what they wanted for the future. "Sometimes I feel like people do not see us," Emma had said quietly. "They see the girls who talk to spirits, but they do not see Emma and Lucy." "I want to help people," Lucy had added. "But I want to help them as myself, not as some kind of magical thing." Jake had hugged them both close, feeling the familiar surge of protectiveness that had never left him since that first night in the Apache camp.
You are not magical things, he had told them firmly. You are my daughters, and you are exactly who you are supposed to be. Now, watching them work with their students, Jake felt proud of how they had grown. Emma had inherited her mother's kindness and her father's stubborn determination, while Lucy had developed a quick wit and an ability to make friends with anyone. They were normal girls in most ways. They argued about chores, giggled over boys in town, and complained about having to wear their good dresses to church. But sometimes Jake would catch them staring off into the distance with expressions that reminded him of that night in the canyon, and he knew that their experience had marked them permanently. They carried scars that most people could not see. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Jake stepped out of the schoolhouse to see a familiar figure riding up the path, Captain Morrison, now Major Morrison, still serving with the 7th Cavalry. The officer dismounted and walked over to shake Jake's hand. "Jake," Morrison said, his face serious. "I need to talk to you. And the girls, if they are willing." "What is it?" Jake asked, though he already suspected he knew. Morrison glanced toward the schoolhouse, where Emma and Lucy were still working with their students. "There is trouble brewing up north. Some of the young Apache warriors are getting restless, saying the treaty is not being honored properly. And some of the new settlers are pushing for the army to take action." Jake felt his heart sink. This was what he had been dreading for 5 years, the moment when the peace would be tested beyond its limits. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that the territorial governor has asked me to consult with Emma and Lucy," Morrison said. "People remember what happened in the church. They think if the girls could speak to the spirits again, maybe we could avoid another war." "Absolutely not," Jake said immediately. "Those girls have given enough. They deserve to live normal lives." "I agree with you," Morrison said quickly. "But I needed to ask. The pressure is coming from Washington now, not just the local officials." Emma appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse, having heard the conversation. "What kind of trouble, Major Morrison?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Fighting between young Apache warriors and some of the newer settlers. 3 people dead so far, property destroyed. Some people are saying the peace treaty was a mistake." Lucy joined her sister, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "And they want us to fix it," she said, not really asking a question. "They want you to try," Morrison admitted. "But I have told them that you have done enough. You were children when all this started, and you are still children now." Emma and Lucy exchanged a look that Jake recognized, the same silent communication they had shared since their ordeal in the canyon. "We are not children anymore, Major," Emma said quietly. "And we have always known this day might come. The spirits told us that the peace would be tested," Lucy added. "They said there would be times when people forgot why it was important." Jake stepped between his daughters and the Major. "I said no, and I meant it. You two are not responsible for keeping the peace in the entire territory." But Emma put her hand on his arm. "Pa," she said gently, "what if we do not have to carry the spirits this time? What if we just go and talk to people? We understand both sides, and people trust us." "It is too dangerous," Jake insisted. "If the situation is as bad as the Major says, you could be caught in the middle of fighting." "We were caught in the middle of fighting before," Lucy pointed out. "And we survived that." Major Morrison cleared his throat. "There is something else," he said reluctantly. "Red Hawk specifically asked for Emma and Lucy to come. He says his people will listen to them when they will not listen to anyone else." That gave Jake pause. Red Hawk had become a good friend over the years, often bringing his own children to the school on the ranch. The Apache leader was not one to ask for help unless the situation was truly desperate. "Where is this happening?" Jake asked. "Canyon de Chelly," Morrison replied. "About 3 days' ride north of here. Red Hawk is camped there with most of the peaceful Apache, trying to keep the young warriors from starting a full-scale war." Jake knew Canyon de Chelly. It was sacred ground to the Apache, a place of ancient cliff dwellings and spiritual significance. If the trouble had reached there, it was serious indeed.
Emma and Lucy were already walking back toward the schoolhouse.
"We need to tell Miss Collins that school will be cancelled for a few days," Emma called over her shoulder.
"And we should pack our traveling clothes."
"Girls, wait," Jake said, following them.
"We have not decided anything yet."
But Lucy turned back to him with a smile that was both childish and wise.
"Yes, we have, Pa. You know we have to go.
It is what the lady in white would want us to do." Jake felt the familiar chill that came whenever the girls mentioned their mysterious spiritual guide. In 5 years, they had spoken of her less and less, but she still appeared to them sometimes in dreams, offering guidance and comfort.
"If we do this," Jake said finally, "we do it my way.
No taking risks, no putting yourselves in danger.
At the first sign of trouble, we leave."
"Agreed," Emma said, already gathering her things.
"And I go with you," Jake added. "I am not letting you face this alone." "We would not want to," Lucy said, hugging him tightly. "We are a family. We face things together."
3 days later, they arrived at Canyon de Chelly to find a situation worse than Major Morrison had described. The canyon was divided into 2 camps: Red Hawk's peaceful Apache on one side, and a group of young warriors led by a firebrand named Running Wolf on the other.
Between them, on a high mesa overlooking the canyon, was a detachment of cavalry soldiers who looked ready for war. The immediate cause of the trouble was a dispute over water rights.
The new settlers had dammed a stream that had traditionally been used by the Apache, claiming they needed the water for their crops. The Apache had torn down the dam, and the settlers had responded by attacking an Apache hunting party. Now both sides were armed and angry, and the situation was balanced on the edge of violence. Jake set up camp with Emma and Lucy near Red Hawk's group, far enough from the soldiers to avoid suspicion but close enough to get help if needed. The Apache leader welcomed them warmly, but Jake could see the strain in his weathered face.
"It is good that you came," Red Hawk said as they sat around his fire that first evening.
The young men, they listened to no one anymore.
"They say the whites will never honor the treaty, that fighting is the only way. What about Running Wolf?" Emma asked. "Will he talk to us?"
Red Hawk shrugged.
"He might. He remembers what you did in the church.
But he is very angry. His sister was one of those killed in the attack by the settlers." Lucy looked across the canyon toward the other Apache camp, where fires glowed in the gathering darkness.
"We have to try," she said simply. "If we do not, people will die."
That night, as they prepared for sleep, Jake found himself thinking about how much his life had changed since that morning 5 years ago when he had heard the Whitman girls screaming. He had been a broken man then, consumed by grief and anger over the loss of his own family. Now he was the father of 2 remarkable young women who carried themselves with dignity and purpose despite everything they had endured.
The next morning brought bad news.
During the night, someone, possibly Apache, possibly settlers, possibly soldiers trying to provoke an incident, had attacked a supply wagon heading to the nearby town. 2 men were dead, and tensions in the canyon had reached the breaking point. Running Wolf sent word that he would meet with Emma and Lucy, but only if they came alone to a neutral location on the canyon floor. Jake immediately refused, but the girls talked him into allowing it after Running Wolf agreed to meet them in broad daylight with witnesses from both sides present. The meeting took place at the ruins of an ancient cliff dwelling, with Jake and Major Morrison watching from a distance while Red Hawk and some of Running Wolf's warriors observed from the opposite direction. Emma and Lucy walked calmly to the center of the ruins, where Running Wolf waited with 2 of his lieutenants. Even from a distance, Jake could see that the young Apache leader was consumed with rage and grief. Running Wolf was maybe 25 years old, but he carried himself like a man who had seen too much violence and lost too much to ever find peace again. The conversation lasted for over an hour, with Emma and Lucy doing most of the talking while Running Wolf listened with growing agitation. Jake could not hear what was being said, but he could see the tension building in the young warrior's body language. Then, Running Wolf suddenly drew his knife. Jake started to run toward them, his hand reaching for his gun, but Emma raised her hand to stop him. She stepped closer to Running Wolf, apparently unafraid of the blade in his hand. What happened next was something Jake would remember for the rest of his life. Lucy began to sing. It was an Apache lullaby that Changing Woman had taught her years ago, a song about children sleeping safely while their parents watched over them. Her young voice carried clearly in the still canyon air, and the effect on Running Wolf was immediate. The knife dropped from his hand as he sank to his knees, overcome by grief for his dead sister. Emma knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder as he wept for all the losses he had suffered. When the song ended, Running Wolf looked up at the two girls with tears streaming down his face. He spoke in Apache, his voice broken but sincere. He says he remembers being a child and feeling safe. Red Hawk translated for Jake later. He says your daughters reminded him that there were things worth preserving, not just things worth fighting for. The crisis did not end immediately. There were still tense negotiations, angry words, and moments when violence seemed inevitable. But Running Wolf's change of heart had broken the momentum toward war. Other young warriors began to listen when Emma and Lucy talked about the possibility of a future where Apache and white children could grow up together. The water rights dispute was resolved through compromise. The settlers would share the stream with the Apache during certain seasons, and the Apache would help maintain irrigation ditches that benefited everyone. It was not a perfect solution, but it was one that both sides could live with. As they prepared to leave Canyon de Chelly, Changing Woman approached Emma and Lucy one last time. The old medicine woman was frilier than she had been 5 years earlier, but her eyes were still bright with wisdom and spiritual power. She spoke to the girls in Apache, her words gentle but serious. When she finished, she embraced them both and walked away without looking back. What did she say? Jake asked Emma as they watched the old woman disappear into the rocks. She said our work as spirit carriers is finished, Emma replied. She said we have learned to help people without needing magic, just by being ourselves. And she said something else, Lucy added. She said the lady in white told her to give us a message, that we have kept our promise to the dead children, and now we are free to live for ourselves. As they rode south toward home, Jake reflected on the changes he had seen in his daughters over the past few days. They had faced anger and violence with courage and compassion, had risked their lives to prevent a war, but they had done it as themselves, as Emma and Lucy Thompson, not as mystical figures carrying the voices of the dead. They were still special, would always be special because of what they had experienced and overcome. But they were also normal young women with their own dreams and desires, their own futures to build. What do you want to do when you grow up? Jake asked Lucy as they made camp on their last night on the trail. I want to be a teacher, she said without hesitation. Like Miss Collins, but for Apache children and white children together. I want to help them understand each other. And you, Emma? Jake asked. Emma was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I want to write, she said finally. I want to write down all the stories, what really happened in the canyon and the church, what it was like to carry the spirits. Not for newspapers or books that make us sound like magical creatures, but for people who want to understand how peace really happens. Jake smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction at their answers. They had found their own paths, their own ways to honor what they had been through without being trapped by it. As they settled down to sleep under the vast Arizona sky, Jake whispered a prayer of thanks to Sarah, wherever she was. She had guided him to save these girls, but, in the end, they had saved themselves, and had saved him in the process. The peace would hold, Jake knew. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments when old fears and prejudices threatened to destroy what had been built. But there were also people like Emma and Lucy growing up in the territory now, people who had learned that different did not mean enemy, that understanding was stronger than fear. The painted markings on their faces had faded years ago, but the wisdom they had gained would last forever. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all, not that two little girls had once carried the voices of the dead, but that they had grown into young women who carried hope for the living. Enough, Jake whispered into the darkness, echoing the words he had shouted in the canyon 5 years earlier. They are mine, and I am theirs, and we are family. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, not in anger or fear, but in simple acknowledgement that the night was peaceful, and all was well.